So good afternoon and welcome. I'm going to take this off just for the introduction, and as just a reminder, if you could keep them on during the presentation, that would be wonderful. But my name is David Breslin. I'm the DeMartini Family Curator and Director of Curatorial Initiatives here at the Whitney. And I had the great privilege to co-curate the Whitney Biennial 2022, Quiet as It's Kept, with my dear friend and colleague, Adrienne Edwards. And it's a show that we're thrilled about for many reasons, but one of them is that it includes the work of the incomparable Ivy Kwan Arce and Julie Tolentino. I'm just going to stop and clap for that right now. For those of us joining virtually, you can access closed captioning in English by turning on the feature on the options bar. And thank you, Bonnie, for the live captioning. And a huge thanks to Megan Hoyer and Andy Hawks for their elegant shaping of today's program. I want to acknowledge that here at the Whitney, we are on the lands of the Lenape people. Alongside the Lenape, many other indigenous nations have ancestral ties to the place now known as New York, including the 6 Haudenosaunee nations, Seneca, Cayuga, Tuscarora, Mohawk, Oneida, and Onondaga, and the Shinnecock and Postpatock. I'm thrilled to be introducing today's conversation, Activism for Global Pandemic Equity. It is one facet of a multifaceted project for the biennial by Ivy and Julie entitled Echo Position. The project does many things, but one key aim has been to center the role of women, particularly the role of women of color, in HIV/AIDS activism. If you haven't had a chance to see their installation on the 6th floor, please do so. We're open late tonight, and you can find information on upcoming performances and lectures on whitney.org, so please see it there. One beginning for this project was in 2018 when the Whitney hosted a symposium on visual arts and the AIDS epidemic that drew on an oral history of the same name undertaken by the Smithsonian's Archive of American Art. That project and the convening here at the Whitney featured conversations with artists, activists, and oral historians about their memories of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and the 1990s and its impact on cultural production. One of the speakers that day was Julie Tolentino, and in the audience was Ivy, who bravely and pointedly asked the question, "Why are you sitting there while I sit here?" In her question, we might also hear questions like, why are some names known and not others? Why are some stories familiar while others remain obscure? What if we acknowledge how interconnected this work is? These questions have guided the collaboration between Ivy and Julie in the 4 years since they met here at the Whitney. That symposium was held in conjunction with the David Wojnarowicz exhibition that I had the pleasure of co-curating with David Keel. We started the acknowledgements for the catalog for that exhibition with an exchange between Nan Goldin and Wojnarowicz. She asked him how it felt to be, quote unquote, the moral conscience of our time, end quote. After some humble deferring, he responded, quote, "We all affect each other, especially by being open enough to make each other feel less alienated in terms of what the experience of living in this country is. We all have that possibility or embody that possibility of having profound effects on each other," end quote. Ivy and Mark who's joining us virtually, I feel that's a good place as any to introduce the two of you. Ivy Kwan Arce is an AIDS survivor who has been living with HIV for 3 decades. As a patient of Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, who co-founded the PWA Health Group, Ivy became part of the Women's Treatment Group and Pediatric Working Group. She was part of the grassroots of what became essential HIV/AIDS organizations, such as Asian Pacific Islander Coalition on HIV/AIDS and God's Love We Deliver. In 2012, she recommitted to the fight to end AIDS by getting involved with pre-exposure prophylaxis PrEP, specifically focusing on access for women. She is based in New York City. Mark Harrington is a writer, researcher, and academic, an activist whose informed engagement in the AIDS research effort has advanced our knowledge about AIDS treatments. He is executive director of the Treatment Action Group, TAG, which he co-founded in 1992, and has been affiliated with a number of committees for the National Institute of Health and the World Health Organization. He previously was a member of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power Act Up, 1988 to 92, and Harrington is based in New York City. Ivy and Mark have conceived of this program and have invited the participation of Kenley Sekweze, Ezio Tavora de Santos Philo, and Vivisuka Dubola, who will be introduced by Ivy and Mark directly. One final note, restrooms are located outside of the theater on this floor. If you need to exit for any reason, please use the door at the back of the room where you entered. It's an incredible pleasure and honor to have you here, Ivy and Mark, and for our guests who have come very far away, so thank you for that. Thank you for convening this program, Ivy, and thanks to all of you who have joined here today in person and online. To echo Wanarovich, you bring with you your profound effects, and we can feel them here in the room. Please join me in welcoming Ivy and Mark.
So Mark originally was going to moderate, and we have some slides just to present ourselves, just so it's a quick history of us, some of our work. I don't have a lot of pictures of that time. Through this project with Julie, actually I had friends send me like testimonies from 1992 where I didn't want to be photographed, but it was asking for the first funding for Aperture before they were an organization. So some people started sending me that just because they were bored during COVID. Just that last, this is the lawsuit that I have with Gilead at this moment, challenging the patent and the cost of the drug, and also the extension of patent, and are asked to change that practice. So we're just presenting also Mark's slide as well.
No, we can't hear you.
Hey, Mark, you're muted.
I am muted. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I wish I was there with you all today, but I came down with SARS-CoV-2, so I'm recuperating at home. I want to thank you all for coming. This is a group of some of the people that I love the most in the world. When Ivy and Julie first came to talk to me about this idea, we came up with, because Ivy and Julie's work is so much about globality, the globe, and love, and how people love each other all over the world, and how some of the most important people to us are very far from us. And that's embodied in a very beautiful way in their work, Echo Position, that you should all go see if you haven't seen it yet here at the Biennial. Ivy and I came together in the most natural and wonderful of ways through ACT UP New York and through AIDS activism. We even shared the same physician in the early to mid-90s, Dr. Joe Sonnabend, RIP. He was one of the physicians who treated the most people with AIDS in New York City, pioneered community-based research, and also really influenced all of our lives as activists to this day, and pointing out that in order to treat AIDS, you had to treat all of the other infections that came with it. So the theme of our panel today is something that Ivy and I have been talking about for a long time, which is pandemic equity, or rather pandemic inequity. We live in a world where there are constant pandemics, and some epidemics get more resources than others. And a lot of times that's determined by where you live, and not only by where you live, but who you are within where you live. And so people who are well off and live in well-off countries, or sometimes even in poor countries, get things, and everyone else doesn't. But one of the great struggles against these inequities over the last 40 years has been the AIDS activist movement, and more specifically, AIDS treatment activism, which came out of ACT UP New York and out of Project Reform in San Francisco, and then later came out of Pela Vida in Brazil, and came out of Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, and also came out of what became AfroCAB which is centered in Zambia, but has members all over the continent. And so just imagine what the world would be like if there had been no ACT UP and no treatment activism. There would be, instead of 40 million people being dead from AIDS, there would be more than 80 million people dead. And 40 million is itself already an unimaginably huge and horrible number. But not only has our work revolutionized the diagnosis, the treatment, and the prevention of HIV, but it is also beginning to revolutionize the treatment of tuberculosis. It has led to advances in the cure of hepatitis C. And we're still working with all these other infections that plague us that keep coming out of seemingly everywhere. For example, just 2 days ago, I was able to get, from the City Department of Health, I was able to get my first shot of the Jynneos, which is a vaccine for monkeypox, which should have been available a lot earlier because the US had quite a few 100,000 doses that were stuck in a factory in Denmark. But anyway, they're starting to move. And then later that same day, I came down with SARS-CoV-2, but thanks to modern medicine, there's a treatment that you can take which helps to cure you in 5 days or so. So we're all here because of science, and we're all here because of activism, and we're all here because we're community. And no matter where you're from, you can join our movement, and no matter where we're from, we'll work in solidarity with you. And so I can't be more proud of what the people on stage and also GreenSec have accomplished. And we have a lot more work to do. And for all those who attended, thank you for coming and become part of our movement and help us save millions of lives and make the lives of those who are still living more wonderful and lengthy. Thank you so much.
Introduce each speaker, starting with Ezio.
I have my own. Well, first of all, I would like to say how much of an honor to be invited to a session like this. Obviously, thanks to Mark, an old friend since the 90s, and Ivy. I mean, and this guy who has done revolutionized the response in Africa. I mean, with so much power. So this is for us a great honor to to be talking in outside the scientific rooms. I think I was saying like how nervous I was to be with you here today, because this environment is completely different from what I am used to. But this, well, at least this room looks like a conference room, so I'm a little less nervous because of that. But it's very important to acknowledge the work that this museum is doing, and the extremely important opportunity to be dialoguing with the society and reflecting what the society is producing, and what is the relation with art, and what is the relation of what the society produces. A friend of mine who was a museum director in Chicago, he was also saying like how important this is in university museums in this country, and it's a very, very important thing. So thanks very much for this opportunity. I mean, we have, I mean, with a long story with Mark, particularly because we at Pela Vida, which was a Persons with AIDS organization, that first one in Brazil, we were very inspired, obviously, by ACT UP, and always also very inspired when Treatment Action Group was formed. I think this jumping to maybe 20 years in time, I mean, think this was also the inspiration for us to also face tuberculosis, which is the biggest killer in for people living with HIV and AIDS. And it was the most the killer, the number one killer before COVID, even more than HIV and AIDS itself. So and so we are through science and through mobilization, we have been making enormous progress. And Mark and I, we started doing mobilization back in 2002. This year was like 20 years in TB. And we started with social mobilization down in Brazil. Mark organized it at the same year, the first event to engage AIDS activists in tuberculosis, showing how important that was. I remember 1 year after that here in New York, I was with Zaki Ahmed from South Africa, from Treatment Action Campaign, and he was making fun of me. He was like, "Now you are working with TB, right? So why is that you are abandoning HIV and AIDS?" And he was not very. He didn't understand very well. Next year, one year after that, Zaki was completely convinced, and he said, like, he grabbed me and said, like, "I think we lost the train all these years. We should have started doing this before." So this is our work. I mean, depends on a multiple factor. I mean, it's not about individualities, but it's about collective work. We cannot do anything by ourselves, and this what is the aim of what we do is to improve the quality of life of our countrymen and women, and to make sure that we can improve the quality of life of people living in different places. So I think this is a great opportunity to be here with you to discuss like how we provoked a response in our countries for HIV and AIDS in such a different scenario, how we are tackling other pandemics like tuberculosis and now COVID. So how do we react towards that, and how the societies get organized for that? So and so I am very thankful for this opportunity. So I will stop here so that we have more conversation. Thank you.
We'll introduce Kenley. No, Buseka right now, who couldn't be in person with us. So Mark, maybe you can give some context as we see some of her amazing slides that she sent in.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
You can maybe talk a little bit about her, because you just saw her also.
Yeah. Uyeseka Debula is one of the most amazing activists I've ever met. She grew up in the townships. She graduated from high school and was diagnosed with HIV quite young, and was determined, at first was really hopeless, and then came to the Treatment Action Campaign, which she became a very, very accomplished mobilizer for. And then in 2008, she actually became the General Secretary, which is the leader of this great group of South African activists who revolutionized HIV and TB care in their countries, fighting to get access to everybody for free in the world's largest pandemic, which is still the largest pandemic, but they have the largest treatment program in the world now. And then Uyeseka proceeded to finish college, go to grad school, get a PhD, and she is leading women's activism, and she's also leading a group to improve civil society responses to HIV in South Africa. And in the meantime, she also just came and dazzled the hell out of the Montreal International AIDS Conference in Montreal, where she was super overbooked, gave a bunch of talks, came to a TAG, Partners in Health and Doctors Without Borders campaign launch for an event to speed up the introduction of new regimens for all forms of TB that are safer and take shorter to cure you than previous ones. And she's just an incredible activist and right in the middle of her wonderful career, and we can't wait to see what she'll do next. And we are very sad that she wasn't able to join us here today, but it was great to see her last week, and she's doing great.
So we did an interview with her, and also with Kenley and Ezio that are about an hour long. So since 2 years ago, like what it's like to, especially for Julie, who has a practice of how we work in projects, but then we had COVID, right? So we had to think about ways that where none of us would be here, like in person, maybe one. So we had all these like little tools, and so we edited a 10-minute as if she was here to have a contribution of a couple of key points that she want to share.
It's really a pleasure to be here and to have these conversations with people I call my leaders. I'm a person who strongly believes that without the influence of the US activists, particularly yourselves, a lot of what we were unable to break through in South Africa was mostly inspired from the US, because we actually saw through you that treatment is possible, but also people were living longer. And that is significant for any person who lives with HIV in the South in the early 2000s, because I was diagnosed in the early 2000s when there was no one. I couldn't name one person who was living with HIV who lived longer than 5 years or was on treatment. And I remember very vividly Mark, Greg coming to South Africa. It was my first time. It was, that thing when people are saying the first time a person with HIV, you can touch them. I was like, no, this is not real. They are alive and they're healthy. And here I was in my head preparing for death, because that's all I could see around me. And we were dying much younger. And mostly it was, heterosexual women and men. It was completely different in terms of sexuality, but it was definitely killing young people. And so seeing also not just, adults living with HIV, but, white men, that was significant for us in South Africa, because the stigma was so high amongst the Black African communities. It was seen as a disease of the poor, the Black. And here, we saw it with our own eyes. ACT UP was one of the inspiration movements in the US, the disruptive nature of ACT UP, challenging big power, not just more powers, the state, private sector, was one of the things that inspired us. And I think, many people think that, in South Africa, who can inspire you? You're coming from an apartheid movement, you're an activist country. Honestly, if you live with a disease that's highly stigmatized, where nobody gives a shit, you do need to look for inspiration. And that inspiration will come from many places. And in this case, for us, it came from the North. Knowing that there is treatment and I can learn about it, and when it comes to South Africa, I will be ready and I'll be the one fighting for it. I think that took me out of depression, because for the first time I became hopeful. I grew from just being a volunteer and took on more leadership positions, even met my husband at tech. Yeah, we do things in organization. I have 2 kids, both HIV negative, one turning 16, other 8. Again, from a person who I never thought that I would even have children. And in fact, when the women's rights organizations were challenging sterilization, I was a perfect candidate for sterilization. If it was offered to me in 2001, when I just found out, I would have immediately agreed to be sterilized, because I actually didn't think that I was worthy of having a child. I didn't think that I would live with myself knowing that I had infected my child. When I did my degree in psychology, I was so excited that, I came from a no science background. I only had a senior high school qualification. I had no post high school, any exposure to education. And here I was talking about neurons. I was like in my class, and people were like, "What? Where do you know these things?" In TAC, that's the University of Life. As you know, TAC was started off by pretty much middle class gay men and women. And so we sometimes we did feel that there was a disconnect between the leadership and the community organizers like myself. Only when we bring 14,000 people in the march, then we are seen, we are strong. and we have good organizers. But the time and the process and the inputs it takes to convince people to join a movement is way beyond 14,000. You cannot quantify that. And those relationships still remain today. We built relationships and we maintain those relationships, and that you can't quantify. In our case, in TAC, because we're a democratic organization, we went through elections, and you know how elections are flawed. So people caucus, they get their own people, and it's mainly going to be men. So I came into the picture that way because I was organizing all my life in Cape Town. And people said, look, you show potential, you can challenge, you're not afraid, and here it is. Of course, I said no. I said, absolutely not, because I don't think the movement was ready for an HIV positive woman who comes from a poor background. I came from a village and I still struggled with English and I couldn't write. I was like, no, I do not want to be taken for granted. I know for granted, I know what I'm good at. I'm good at organizing and I'm good at doing truth and interest. Leave me be where I am. I had to fill in big shoes. Zaki and Sipho were big leaders and still are my leaders today. I was afraid that I'm not gonna, live up to what people expect of me. But also I think deep down, I had my own internalized stigma. I didn't think I was good enough in many ways. Still, sometimes I do. And it's something that we all struggle with, and maybe I struggle with it. For a long time, Tech was able to survive because of the charisma, because of the work we were doing, because we were doing groundbreaking work, because no one was doing what we were doing, and we were challenging power in a very different way. I got to be exposed to a lot of, still a highly patriarchal donor space. It's very racist because I know there were many times where people just couldn't believe that Tech sent 2 Black women to come and ask for money. We had to be accompanied by a white man for us to be believed. You're seen as a child and addressed as a child. I experienced all of that. And if you're not seen as a child, you're seen as a female body that must be touched before you can be listened to. And that, unfortunately, still continues today. We see a lot of young women who are leading movements don't need protection to go to other movements because there's a lot of violence in the way in which we are spoken to, the way we are looked at, the way we are being treated in meetings and disregarded. Well, the interesting thing is that I've never thought of myself as a long survivor until a few people say it. I'm like, am I a long survivor? What is a long survivor? Because if I look at you and Mark, and I'm like, here are long-term survivors. I'm a baby compared to them. But in our context in South Africa, we still have to say, if you're meeting someone who's testing HIV positive today, if you tell them, I have been living with HIV for 19 years, they're like, what? It's still not, many people still don't believe that you can live that long and healthy. The intellectual property system where companies produce medicines and they want or demand a long license to sell those medicines or vaccines, could be ARVs, diabetic medication, hypertension, any medication. They get a license up to 20 years without competition. If you want competition with them, you have to go negotiate with them. Often these medicines are researched using public money, but when they are sold privately by private companies for only to benefit those who can afford. That system has shown in the last 30 years, it can be challenged. We've won big wins in challenging it, but those big wins have not lasted long. I'll give you an example of how they have lasted. With ARVs, for example, most of the countries in the South did not have access to cheap and affordable antiretrovirals. We challenged it, and we had a big win in the early 2000s in Doha, where at least we were allowed that some countries can buy somewhere where it's cheap, and that would allow a lot of people like me to have access to generic version of the drugs, which is cheaper. It needs to be killed. That system needs to be killed. If there's one violent language I have to use today, we have to kill the IP system. It has killed so many of my friends. It killed so many of my relatives and my family members. We cannot let it continue anymore. Not for HIV, not for TB, not for diabetes, not for any disease. And we don't need a system that is greedy, a system that only privileges only a few who can afford. We have to organize ourselves and support each other across the globe, not only those activists in your country. Do solidarity activities with others in other countries who are struggling with the same challenge. So don't work alone, just in your country, also connect with other activists. And that's the only way I know how I have become powerful in my work.
So now we're going to introduce Kenley, who actually was with Mark and Vuiseka a couple days ago. So
Thank you, Ivy, Mark, for this initiative. As you heard, my name is Kenley Sikwese. I live in Lusaka in Zambia. And I lead an organization called Afro-Cab Treatment Access Partnership. What an honor and a privilege to be here and to be thought of as a thought leader of some sort and to bring a story to such an august house as this one, in such a wonderful facility. And I echo Ezio's words. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's a real privilege for us. I am rather daunted by the fact that I happen to be, although I'm older than Vuiseka and somewhere in the age range of Mark and others, I am the youngest in terms of activism. I came to the game late. A lot of these colleagues of mine did the groundwork, and I'm in awe of what they achieved, and many of you in this room. And I came much later. And in coming much later, perhaps I was privileged enough to look at an address, have the chance to mobilize colleagues to look at some other sort of pending issues. If you imagine that what Vuiseka and others will be have talked about, at the time that we were dying like flies in the 90s, mid-90s to 2000. When TAC and others began to start the access movement in Africa, millions of Africans were dying, and millions of South Americans and Asians were dying from HIV while there was treatment in the North. And by the time we had highly active antiretrovirals in the mid-90s here, there was absolutely nothing available. There were a few that could access some drugs in the private sector, but they were costing in those days $3,000-4,000 per person, and you had to pay for it from your pocket. Fast forward, and I when I was coming here, and I was thinking about the number of friends whom I lost in that period when we would have had access to treatment, had there been equity in accessing drugs in the world then, HIV or anti-HIV drugs then. And fast forward, by between about 2003, 2004, we started seeing a little bit of introduction of antiretrovirals in the public health sector. PEPFAR came in, which was really the tipping point. And, we take our hats off to the US citizens for saving so many of us through PEPFAR. And, so many of us were able to start our treatment, in the public sector. But by then, we were still using drugs that you guys were coming off we still had the stavudines. You remember the D40s. We still had some places we're still using DDIs. And I'm talking not 1991, no. We still had quite a lot of drugs that you guys were coming off. So we still had inequity. We still had what I might refer to as drug access apartheid of some sort, where there were better drugs in the north and we were getting somewhat suboptimal drugs in the south. Fast forward, somewhere around the mid 2000s, around 2010, tenofovir, for instance, an example, which was a very well tolerated drug, was 10 years old around, or 12, 14 years old here in the north. We still couldn't get it, excuse me, in the south. So my colleagues and I came together around about that time and started asking the questions, well, we are alive, but is this life worth living when you look at the quality of life, with the impact of, lipodystrophy, the pins and needles. It was like walking on pins and needles with some of the drugs we were on. I remember some of us had to go to massage parlors. Well, not massage parlors, rather, where women do their nails. Nail salons, thank you. And the reason why we went there as men, and you must understand, for a man to walk into a nail salon is a big deal. But we would walk in there just to be able to get foot massage, to reduce the pains and needles that we're getting from side effects. And, but that was a few privileged people that could afford to even do that. Many of us just, of our people just put up with that life. And so we began to start asking our questions, what is this the best there is to offer? And so we began this movement called AfroCAB, or at the time it was the African Community Advisory Board, which really just wanted to focus on optimal ARVs. If we have good ARVs, how can we accelerate access to them in our communities in Africa? And so we started this movement, and some of our target areas were to, replace D4T, which, I'm happy to say, through advocacy, working together with different partners, we were able to succeed. And we took it off very, very quickly. Global Fund and others who fund HIV treatment in Africa, stepped in to buy back, because we were so desperate. We said, we cannot wait. And they bought back the stavudine and the D14, replaced it with TDF or tenofovir. And we were looking at new molecules, and I think at that time, the widely used drug called dolutegravir was not approved. But we were watching it and looking at, wow, this could be the game changer of HIV treatment. You have a strong, robust, effective, well-tolerated drug. Can you imagine if we had it in first line? I mean, now we make it sound so ordinary, but 2011, 2012, it was a pipe dream. But this movement began to accelerate, and eventually we began to make noise about access to efavirenz, and people started thinking about dose reducing efavirenz to a strong dose to a weaker dose to improve access tolerability. So we could at least, and we were thinking about the quality of life of people living with HIV. Yes, they were alive, but having really, really difficult lives. We were being called lazy because of the effect of efavirenz. We could, you're always feeling drowsy and sleepy. And people probably thought, this guy is always high, from the impact of the drugs. But it was really nasty. And fast forward, when we began to see these molecules come through, we began to make noise and started engaging. We started meeting, CEOs of GSK to try and get them to accelerate what Vuyiseka was talking about, getting over patent barriers, getting them registered, issued with voluntary licenses so that generic manufacturers in India can manufacture them quickly. We began to engage other, players in the global south who make drugs accessible. Here in the US, if a drug is approved by FDA, your doctor can give it to you. In Africa, it doesn't work that way. It has to be pre-qualified by the WHO, or rather they have to get a license for it. If there's a patent barrier, then it has to be pre-qualified by the WHO, and then it has to be, local regulators have to approve it, and so a drug can take a long time, and we wanted to cut this process short. Fast forward, by 2015, we had, dolutegravir in our guidelines as an alternative, and When women, I think, so for those of you who follow access to treatment, was refused for women of childbearing age, we mobilized again our women and asked them, would you rather take dolutegravir or go to efavirenz because of this signal? And they said no. The benefits of dolutegravir, this new molecules, far outweighs the risks of getting, our unborn children getting neurotube defects. And so we began this movement in order to improve the quality of our lives. And we are trying to do the same for prevention. When the new molecule of the long-acting injectable was approved for prevention, since we couldn't use it in treatment in Africa yet because of the cold chain of the combination drug, we focus more on prevention. And the manufacturer, ViiV, would not let us have access to it through voluntary licensing. And this movement continues to fight for access to this drug. And for the first time, imagine this drug having been approved in December through activism again. And we will talk a little bit more about that. We were able to get it rapidly, licensed for voluntary manufacturing, and it was just announced at the AIDS conference. We will tell you a little bit more story about that in much more detail. But what we're trying to say is basically that through activism, through fighting for equity is not given to you. You have to fight for it. And the voices of our colleagues in the North and, everybody that has worked in medicine, in access to medicines has played such an important role. And we look forward to discussing that and, demonstrating just how powerful community voices can make a difference and increase equity. Thank you.
So in the process of trying to figure out, what are the many stories we wanted to bring forward was the notion of like campfire activists telling stories, right? So for a long time, I kept on telling the story about Brazil. So one of the slides that was there, maybe it went by really quickly. Breaking patent is something that we continually talk about in this country, and we're completely enslaved by the price and the whole of the patent. For example, the drug that I take is about $30,000 in this country, but Australia is probably $60 a year, and how that happens. So that campfire story is a story that I would hear in the 90s through the PW Health Group, but we didn't have internet. So a lot of those stories we were separated over time and many deaths. So when I talked to Mark, I'm like, where did that land? Who is it? Can we reconnect? And that was Ezio. So the story with Ezio, which that slide is really important because breaking the patent, they were able to do it between 92 and 96. And how did you do that? That you were able to challenge and break the patent, make it there to save millions of lives. While we're just still very young, trying to break the patent, and we're not breaking anything except the bank.
Thank you. I think this has a long story of mobilization and how the pressure happened, and also where we saw opportunities. One of the most interesting things was a small pharmaceutical company down in Rio, which started a reverse engineering a process to copy the molecule for AZT. I'm talking about 1990, 91. And this small company based in Rio started producing AIVs, AZT specifically. There was nothing else but AZT. And I remember when I first bought my first bottle, I paid something like the equivalent to $1,500 US, equivalent to that in Brazilian money at the time. And who could afford such a thing? And when this company came into into the scenario, immediately, like magic, the price reduced like almost the half in US dollars, in equivalent to the US dollars, and then continue to drop as there were clearly the discussion on the market in the international level. In a few years, through activism, because it's very important to highlight that the key components of the AIDS program mostly came from the community organizations. I mean, how the society got organized to provide a response in Brazil was very similar to this country here. I mean, the US and Brazil share a very similar profile of the epidemic and how it was spread and what was the visibility and how it got organized. So these two countries are extremely similar in terms of history. But one thing which was interesting that we could, the social mobilization pushed, and there was clearly the technical conditions to do, it was to do that, to do the reverse engineering and start producing the molecules down in the country. So public laboratories started doing that for many drugs. I remember a few years later, I mean, the DDI produced in Brazil by the generic in Brazil was better than the how to say the bioequivalence and biodisponibility of the medication proved to be better than the mark the label of the original developer. So so this gave conditions in the country to negotiate in the international level, especially with the pharmaceutical companies, etc. But one thing that's also important to say is that Brazil, still during the military regime, we started what we call the health movement, which ended by creating the concept of the universal health system, which is the largest health system in the world, larger than any other country, which is the Brazilian SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde, which means a unified healthcare system, and which provides a full universal access to anyone. And this is funded by public money, Brazilian taxpayers' money, from the federal level, state level, and the municipal level. So the creation of this unified health system created the conditions also for the public laboratories to be developing and dispersing medication, etc. So the environment was actually created by this pressure, and that's why it's so important that we have the technical conditions, but we have the social mobilization to do that, to push for to have access to medicine. So that made it possible for Brazil to better negotiate with big pharmaceutical companies. And differently from most countries, when a pharmaceutical company negotiates with Brazil, basically, of course, we have, like Canada, we have a unified health system parallel to a private system in parallel to that. I mean, it's not just that we just have one thing. We have both. But when you talk about certain diseases, like most of the drugs for cancer or for hypertension or diabetes or HIV or tuberculosis, the client is the unified health system. So when the pharmaceuticals sell to them, I mean, they sell to one client in an enormous quantity. So that allows also Brazil to negotiate better. But the problem has always been the sanctions that the country would suffer. I mean, Brazil is one of the 10 largest economies in the world, and what would be like the sanctions to go against the the intellectual property and to discuss that. So that has always been a challenge. But we did how to say negotiate with Africa. Brazil also helped producing a factory in Mozambique of generics. There was a lot of also partnership with other African countries. In 2001, here in this city, I was still at Pela Vida. I'm basically doing TB work since 2002 in particular, 6 in particular, but since 2002. But in 2001, before the General Assembly on AIDS, the famous General Assembly on AIDS in 2001, we organized here with GMHC, the Gay Men Health Crisis, here in New York, a fabulous event where we were discussing exactly that, and we were pushing the AIDS program manager was there, and one of the key researcher, a representative of Fiocruz was here too at the Rockefeller rooms, and I remember that we posed the question like, so why Brazil is not helping the neighbor countries and producing also for generic drugs and make them available in other Latin American countries? And the NTP, well, because this, you know, we don't do enough for our own consumption. And then we asked Eloa, Paulo is saying that Brazil cannot produce more than it's doing, and she said, like, we can produce 10 times more. It's just a question of Brasilia to tell us to do, but Brasilia won't tell us to do, because Brazil is always facing economic challenges, trade sanctions if this is made. So this is part of the explanation why we cannot cooperate more. I mean, it's business. I mean, and the pressure of profit. So we have to discuss this in a better way.
So not having universal health care in this country basically puts us at a goal that we can't reach, right? But the story, the thread of this 40 years that Brazil has been able to do that and doing factories in Africa is that now that history, that work is unbroken, because now is about to be able to produce injectable PrEP for 30 million women. And that's really like, we turn around and do not see those steps are continuous work that started in 92 to this moment where you basically are going to deliver the story and the importance of you being the new one, carrying on this work. But yet this inertia of you taking a lot of the things that people are forgotten, but you're picking it up, and you and Wiseka are basically taking to this incredible finish line for this particular story.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. I think as I said, in December, everybody was really excited. I think, as you know, many of us in this room might have been, anticipating or looking forward to something different from oral PrEP, was something like a long-acting injectable. So when it was approved, we were all very excited, and it was. And I mentioned a little bit about dolutegravir just for some context, because the same manufacturer, ViiV, which makes dolutegravir, also developed the long-acting injectable cabotegravir. When we were talking to them in 2013-14 about access to, or 2014, about access to rapid access to dolutegravir through voluntary licensing, they were very, very, very willing, very forthcoming, and it was magic. Of course, they played their usual pharmaceutical games here and there, but overall, they were quite engaging. And so this is how we got dolutegravir quickly in Africa. But this time, with the injectable, it was like talking to a different animal. We didn't even bother to engage them, quite frankly, because we thought, well, Viva are a good company, they're access-oriented, access-minded, we shouldn't bother. But around January, we started hearing that they were becoming very difficult and did not want to offer voluntary or generic manufacturers an opportunity to make this drug, and they wanted to make it themselves. Now, that may sound very generous, but when you imagine that the demand is 30 million plus people, no one company can meet that demand. That's the first problem. Second problem, it's not possible for an originator company like VIV, to manufacture a product that can be affordable in our setting. Now remember, you're paying what, 20? I don't know, what was it now? It started as something, $30,000. Can you imagine, even at their most generous price, let's even assume it was just, 10, well, not even 10, 1% of that price. It wouldn't be accessible because oral prep, remember, only costs less than $60 per person per year. So you're talking about $4 per month for 30 tablets of Truvada. So if you're going to have something that is at least accessible, can be available to people, it had to match that price point. And we knew that VIV would never be able to match that price, and we were right. I'll tell you that, that in a minute. So we called a couple of contacts, big researchers here in the north. Hey, what do you think is going on? And we were shocked and surprised that many of them were siding with the manufacturer, that they were considering and assessing all options. But, really, because it's a very, very difficult product to manufacture, the freezing processes, things I didn't even understand, we're just going to make it very impossible for a generic manufacturer to make it. But we picked up the phone and asked generic manufacturers, mostly in India, and said, you guys, what's your story? We are told you're too dumb to make this product. And they said, no, we actually are ready, but we've been engaging the manufacturer, the originator, VIV, but they're putting too many conditions. We can reformulate it and make cheaper processes in order for us to be able to make it different, but still with the same level of bioequivalence. So it'll be exactly, or be the same as the VIV product. So we went back now, we said, oh, well, this is interesting. So we reached out to VIV. Hey, you guys, can you please issue a voluntary license? Voluntary licenses are important for us because that is the way we can, if you issue a voluntary license, it means anybody who can manufacture that product can apply for that license and say, I want to make it, which is good for us because if you get 3, 4 or more manufacturers, it creates competition. And you know what competition does? It drops price. So this is very important for access in our regions. And this is why AJ was referring to all these loops and challenges that which they faced in Brazil, because I think Brazil went more for the compulsory license or something similar. And so what we did was we engaged them very nicely, guys, please, can you issue this license and so on. And they actually blatantly announced to us, to the world, because we made the request public, so their response was also public. So we have no intentions of making this happen. We will not issue a voluntary license. Anybody who wants to make this price, we will make it, and we will come up with an access price for poor countries, and we will let you know. They wouldn't even discuss the price. But through our contacts, and I must admit, we worked very closely with the Clinton Health Access Initiative and others who helped us understand what that meant. So in terms of technical supply chain and other issues. And their own calculations actually came up with the product actually costing $25. Can you believe it? That actually shouldn't cost more than $25. They did some calculations that even with all R&D factored in, it should not cost more than $25. But it was costing $30,000 a year. And then we also found out that the lowest they could give it to us, what they call an access price, was $300. which is still way, way off the mark. They say 300, 350, all kinds of figures were being weighed. Eventually, they say they couldn't make it supplied for less than 250, which basically meant nobody could access it. And a few days later, we actually were very disappointed, and we told them that. But for some strange reason, they backtracked after the pressure from the community, because that letter really called them out and really, insisted that this approach was unacceptable, and they were going to be responsible for too many infections in poor countries, and they were going to deny, especially women and in very vulnerable populations in our communities, a choice for oral PrEP. And you remember that oral PrEP is although it's very effective, not everybody, especially women, can use it, because remember, the sexual partner would have to know they're on PrEP. The sexual partner would then find out why they're on PrEP. And remember, it also looks like ARVs, so there's risk, and a lot of them, do get, do experience violence. So something like an oral injectable was very, very viable. Was going to make a very, very big difference. Is going to make a very big difference. But what we did was we mobilized 200 voices from all over Africa, Europe, and South America, and demanded VIV reconsider. So they came back and said, okay, we will consider a voluntary license. But remember that it will still take 2-3 years for this product to become available in generic formulation, because it's just being now reverse engineered or whatever processes it has to undergo. So we still need to access the product, in between now and 2025 from VIV Healthcare. So we need a bridging price that at least is equivalent to oral PrEP. This is where now the battle is, because on the 28th, they did announce an agreement with the Medicines Patent Pool. The Medicines Patent Pool is a mechanism. It's literally what it means is a pool where manufacturers can put in their license, and anybody can go to the pool and apply for that license if they meet the terms. And usually the manufacturer originator like VIV would get a royalty for whatever period. But while we've achieved that, the biggest battle starts now, that because we have a product that VIV can supply, we need access to it now. And so we are fighting now the next battle, and this is where we need to come together with everybody, and especially you people that, for whom they demand for rely for profits, to join our voices together and demand that VIV drops the price to less than $60 in order for that product to be accessible in our public health system. Thank you.
So, but to clarify, this injectable, instead of the one that we currently have, which is once a month, is injection every 2 months, that's huge also.
Very, very huge. And as I said, the risks to, for it not only just gives women the option to who can't, people who have challenges with dosing. I think many of us know many people on PrEP and struggle. One, it does help with adherence. It does also, but for our women, really, it's just that risk of violence. Because, at the moment, they have to hide these tablets. Even though, they need them to prevent HIV infection, they have to hide them from their sexual partner. But an injection like that, big change. Big difference. And we had a meeting in Kampala in Uganda about a month ago, where we actually brought a lot of people, about 40 people, 50 people from all over Africa and the world. We had quite, some participants from the US and, Brazil and so on. And asked them, if you were given the option between an oral PrEP, an injectable, or a ring, a vaginal ring, which is also an option that's available at somewhat less maybe effectiveness, but still up there as an option. And out of this group, at least, if you would use that as a sample, at least 80% preferred an injectable, both men and women. And the reasons they gave were especially what we've talked about, this, the privacy, the convenience, and even when you talked about the pain or injection site issues, they still preferred that it would make a big difference, and that women actually said you must explain and tell VIV at the IAS that women want and demand for, for injectable cabotegravir.
So I'm taking a V product, right? That's $30. So you're saying as a consumer that are paying for all this, that I should write a letter to push them to make this happen? As a
Absolutely.
consumer that's paying their bill.
Well, at the moment, it's not even there.
It's not even there.
It's not in the countries. Some of the work we're doing in the background, we're pushing VIV to register. Remember I told you that there are a lot of stages that we have to go through. Although it's been approved, I think it's slightly, the process is slightly shorter because it's got a regulator like FDA approval. So countries, VIV can actually go straight to the country and just register it with a regulator. It takes about 30 days. All it is we want to sell or market this product in your country, and they usually get those registrations very quickly. The challenge is, even if they do that at $350 or $250 or even $200, nobody's going to want it. Nobody's going to afford it. And when you have a donor-dependent public health response, as we do, no donor's going to touch it. If they have the option between paying $60, less than $60 for oral PrEP or $200 for an injectable, they obviously will take the cheaper option. And so this is where we have a big battle, and VIV just has to drop the price. There is no option, and it's not up for discussion, because the lower the price, it means the more people we can put on injectable PrEP, and the less infections we're going to have in our setting.
You also told me, or is it Viseca that told me that part of the reason that you can negotiate this is that in your constitution, healthcare is protected, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this
You're
is...
laughing at me.
No, you're right. Even though our health systems are weak, the fact that it is still universal access makes a difference. And we feel for you here in America, in many ways. And to imagine that this powerful, rich country with every resource imaginable cannot provide basic health as a right to its people is the most shameful thing that and we feel for you. And you have our sympathy. That our governments, even with the much little resources, even if they have to borrow and scrape, at least want to make sure that at least everybody can have access to decent health within the settings and the limitations that we have. But yes, you're absolutely right. It does make a big difference. And if you're talking about a preventable tool, a prevention tool for something that infects and kills, remember that about 1.7 million people still died from AIDS in our region. Another, I don't know, several million people are having, at risk of HIV every year. And so if this important tool is so critical and would definitely be made public, available in the public health sector. I don't think, we don't want it to be sold. It has, unless I want to buy it. But for going back to equity again, it's important that the primary point of access is in the public health sector, where anybody can walk in, get the injection, and walk out and know they are protected from HIV for 60 days.
So Mark, can you hear us now? Because it was a little bit difficult. Yeah, I saw some of the videos of you guys protesting at the AIDS conference. And Viseca actually led the protest. There was a lot of people there. And no, the protest that you guys did against VIV at the AIDS conference last week. Through this process, like Viseca, the game changer for her is patents. She doesn't feel that without that work, there's the equities, it will never be there. As long as the drugs are protected this way and the cost doesn't go down, then there's no equity. And I think you and I talked a little bit about how does this translate for the COVID vaccine done overseas and the difficulties of that. So if you can just quickly because we thought we'll be able to do it overseas and that's going to be a game changer, but difficulties are what? I think you had touched upon that once you have the numbers of the manufacturing,
that now there's fake news that the orders might not match the push to make them the COVID vaccine there. So I just wanted you to talk about that a little bit, especially when I was surprised when I heard that, because I grew up in Bolivia and we're very vaccine adherent, and I also hear a lot of like resistance right now, and we don't have good healthcare to begin with, and what that means. So since you were closer in that process of manufacturing locally, we're hoping what's going to be next year, I believe. So if you can just give us a insight a little bit about that challenge.
Okay. Look, I think, again, inequities exist. When you talk about, and I don't want to put one drug below another, but the general perception is that certain drugs are a little bit more efficacious than others. So I think mRNA vaccines are more desirable, I think, in most countries. But in most of our countries, we're not getting mRNA options. Only a few, doses are coming to our region. And so the idea of local manufacturing is very attractive, but also very challenging, because at the moment, the candidates for local manufacturing are not the ones that are popular. And I don't want to use this forum to mention names of certain drugs so that to discourage certain people, if that's the only option they have, because it's better they have something rather than nothing. But it is still desirable to have those mRNA vaccines as obviously the standard. But because we don't make them in our region, the idea that we have to depend on donations and so on has made the COVID response much more, devastating in our regions. How we address that is a complex and difficult discussion, because while it is desirable to have local manufacturing, the process of getting there, of building the infrastructure, building the capacities, building everything that will be required, would need huge investments. And so, it is going to be, I think, rather than a single country approach, it's going to be, and I think this is where people like the African Union are talking to several regions to come together, not only to just have the capacity to build and make the infrastructure and to make these vaccines, but also to have the right number of volumes, because these things only really make sense when you can make them in bulk. And this is where big pharma takes advantage, because they own and have that bulk capacity all the time. And so can dictate who gets what and those types of things. So it's a bit of a more complex and nuanced discussion, but I think that's more long term. For tomorrow, if we are getting spikes in the countries now, what we need right now is to have access to the available drugs that are being manufactured by the big pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing mRNA, and to make sure that the playing field is leveled. These drugs are expiring in some countries while other people can't access them. And for some of us who have lost relatives, I'm sure some of you and many of you know people who were lost from COVID. I lost my brother last year because he could not get the right vaccine. He was so afraid of getting something, even though he was diabetic. And he said, if only I could get this particular mRNA, I would go. But when it became available this year, it was too late for him, because even though it was available here last year, he couldn't get it. So it's a very difficult discussion, but yes, it is absolutely necessary to level the playing field for all people who need these tools across the world.
Should we do a Q&A since they're here visiting us from so far?
Can I talk into this? Okay, so we thank you guys so much. This has been amazing. We have some time for questions. That's why it's such a this discussion I think could go on for hours, and the campfire stories too. But we have 2 microphones on either side, and we ask so that we don't have to touch the microphones. If you can come up and leave your mask on, we have sound people in the back, so they'll adjust the sound. But if you want to come up and ask a question, we welcome you to do that for our panel, or comments. I think we're open to.
I abandoned the mask, but I
Well,
tested
for you
negative.
guys on stage, no.
But I tested negative yesterday.
Thank you. Thank you. On
Again.
stage, it's helpful to see your faces. For us in the audience, thank you for staying masked.
Yeah, where are those active people with all those questions? Jay?
Hi. Hi. So I have a question. I've been reading a lot lately about, and this might be something that's more in Ivy's realm than the other 2 gentlemen, because it feels like it's a United States specific question. We've been seeing situations where medications that have been in use for years and years and years and decades to treat chronic conditions, many of which are life-threatening, end up getting constrained to one pharmaceutical company because after all of these years, they've become very, very inexpensive, right? And so because they're so inexpensive, because they don't produce a profit, a lot of pharmaceutical companies don't want to make them. And so over time, they end up being made by 1, maybe 2 pharmaceutical companies. And so when we're talking about, reducing the costs of HIV meds and also of COVID meds, right? Because COVID is likely going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for decades, if not centuries, the way things are going. What's the balance there? Because as long as we're stuck in this capitalist system, we're going to have these companies insisting on making profits, and the profit motive is going to outweigh the public health motive for these companies. And so I'd like to hear you all just sort of talk about that balance.
I think maybe Mark may know better. I've like before Mark is that for me it has been the struggle of once we had the protease, I feel that our work changed and we stopped becoming a commodity of people dying and putting that pressure. And that's real because we were very focused in the way we wanted to do things. I'm not saying that there was not other venues, but we were very focused in our goal. But as soon as we had the protease and we were living longer, suddenly we were not a commodity. And the model of giving you something with an extended period is an ideal model, which I feel heavy that is influenced the way we treat other diseases. So we no longer have this wonderful thing of 6 weeks. So at the same time, I recently had COVID, and to look at the package of Paxlovid, to see Fauci to have to take an HIV medication was a script that wrote itself, right? And that was meaningful for me, but at the same time, I feel like we are no longer a commodity that people can tap in and make that change. And I may be wrong. And part of that is because we lose the history of our work because it hasn't been properly documented. And this actually was an opportunity as well, like working with Julie, to continue to put the seeds to make sure that we completely don't lose that. Because in this moment of COVID, we often talked about the structure of our community, our activism, was the structure that created the vaccine center of this country, and people don't know that. And when people say, oh, the struggle was very good, what it actually shows me is that when everybody got sick with COVID, how everybody came and did the work. So I don't know how we can balance that, except to keep on going to DC, to have that universal health care that this country cannot contextually accept. Mark may have something. Mark, do you have something to say about how to level?
Well, I was just, I'm not going to address the fucked up U.S. health system for the time being. But I think something that really pisses me off currently is that situation that Kenley discussed about pandemic inequity with respect to the delivery of COVID vaccines. And the fact the US taxpayer put so many billions into Moderna to create one of the mRNA vaccines means that the US should have been stepping up to demand that Moderna provide manufacturing technical assistance to generic companies in all the regions around the world. They didn't. And the administration likes to claim that they've been, quote unquote, asking Moderna to do this. And they don't seem to not realize that the investment that made the vaccine possible was done by the taxpayer. I find this enraging because this comes up again and again, and in almost every other disease but HIV, the community is not mobilized to demand these reductions, and nor is it mobilized to demand global access. And we have failed to provide global access to the optimal COVID vaccines. It means that COVID is going to go on longer and kill more people. And we have failed. A current example is that monkeypox, which doesn't come from monkeys, but has been an endemic disease for many decades in Central and West Africa, is treatable and preventable with vaccine and a treatment that were developed by the US in response to the anthrax events of 2001. And so there's a modern monkeypox vaccine that doesn't have some of the side effects of the old one. And the White House is bragging this week that they have more than all the other countries in the world. And to me, that was disgusting. I mean, just because the US, paid for the research out of Project BioShield for what they presume might be a smallpox attack which would be invented by terrorism. Russia has some smallpox sitting in a laboratory in Moscow, which doesn't make me feel that comfortable about it. So they developed a new vaccine that's safer, easier to use, requires 2 shots, and they even developed a treatment. And this disease, which is endemic in Africa, the vaccine is only being given to small groups of people in rich countries. So I feel like these battles keep happening again and again. And as usual, it was the AIDS activists that got involved in the monkeypox issue, demanded that it be made a public health emergency that New York State declared and California declared and San Francisco and New York declared, but it took until yesterday for the Biden administration to call it a national emergency. There's no proposal for global access to the vaccine and the treatment. The Republicans are preventing billions of dollars in supplemental COVID funding to provide more vaccines globally by the US, which isn't happening because of the 50 Republicans in the Senate. And for many, many other killer diseases like tuberculosis or viral hepatitis or many others, which are curable, or cancers, which are curable, there's total lack of access to drugs in many parts of the world because of the patent issue that we've been describing. And so we heard that Brazil was afraid to challenge the US, not really because of the individual drug issue, but because there's so many other things that Brazil and the US are doing economically together. And the world has yet to see a country that's really willing to stand up to break the patents in a big way. The European powers have refused to allow licensing of their mRNA product, which is the Pfizer one from that mom and pop Turkish company in Frankfurt called BioNTech. And as an activist, who has spent most of my adult life fighting to end pandemics, the idea that there are going to continue to be these outbreaks that we don't have the political will to meet, and we do have the science, but we're not able to get countries to demand change in the intellectual property system, enrages me. The World Trade Organization restrictions on intellectual property with respect to treatments have killed millions and millions of people. That treaty must be abrogated, or that the pharmaceutical provisions in the treaty must be abolished because it's causing too much harm. And none of the powers in the rich countries have the political will to do that. And the poor countries are afraid of alienating their trade partners in the North, who are also donors. So we're in an impasse. And the AIDS activists haven't been able to overturn the world intellectual property system. We've only been able to mitigate it in little, episodic spurts of progressivism where we're able to get 1 or 2 generations of ARVs out, or we're able to get 1 or 2 generations of TB drugs out. And our movement needs to be stronger and broader if we're going to be able to make these changes happen. Vujicic in a part of the tape that we didn't get to see, but will be online at the Whitney, talked about the need to abolish the intellectual property system for medical treatments and vaccines. So I wish she was here, because her inspiring cry would really be mobilizing. But I just heard inter alia that there was a new introduction of polio into Rockland County last week, and this week they're doing wastewater surveillance, and they found polio in Rockland County and in Orange County. So that's another vaccine preventable disease that is back. In this case, because of communities that don't want to take the polio, they don't want to take vaccines in general, and it frightens me because we don't have. The world has shown it doesn't have the capacity to respond to multiple pandemics at once. And in order to respond to AIDS, it took them 40 years, to get to where we are now. And in the meantime, 40 million people have died. 10 million people are not on treatment right now with HIV, which is an outrage. I guess I'll leave you guys on the panel with that. What are we going to do to close the treatment gap so that those 10 million people can get onto treatment before they die? Finley and Daniel.
While you guys think about that, I think we have a few questions. So I think you were up first, and then we'll go there, and then we have at least one more back there. So please. Sorry.
Hello. So thank you so much for being here. And I have like 100 questions, but I picked one. So I have to notice that if I'm doing my math right, there's collectively maybe like 100 years of activism going on up there. And one thing that I am curious about is, over time, if you have found that certain tactics that you've used in the past no longer work, or you've had to change, especially with certain recent global developments like Trump and Bolsonaro and global debt crisis that is increasingly making low and middle income countries unstable. So if you found the stuff that you were doing in the 90s is no longer effective, or maybe is more effective, just a reflection on the change over time.
Okay, I'll respond to that, but the context in the 90s was very different from what we have now. I mean, the conditions and the context and the political conditions all allow what I previously said to happen, and was a conjunction of factors that led to that. The conditions nowadays are far more complex. It's not that what we did in the 90s wouldn't work today. I still think that social mobilization is still the key. I mean, who sits where means is the game changer. So how can we convince the policymakers and make the countries to deliver what the people need? No? But it happens everywhere. I think that the political conditions nowadays are really scary, I would say, because we are going back decades of advance in many areas. I mean, Brazil has also not only the largest health system, but also the largest vaccination capacity in the world. I mean, Brazilians have always been famous to be so, I would say, vaccines, willing to take vaccines, like in Bolivia and other countries. And with these, I mean, insane campaigns, I mean, we people are avoiding vaccines. I mean, when we have a president, instigating people not to get vaccinated, I mean, you can imagine what can happen. So we are living very difficult times and far more complex when we have to negotiate prices of medication and make them available in different markets. It's not only intellectual property which is in place, but also the conditions of every country to deliver that. But one thing is incredible, that the power of market, the power of economics. If you get to any corner of the planet, you can get Coca-Cola. So how comes that you can get a soft drink and you cannot get medication? It's because there is somehow a lack of willingness. It's not lack of capacity, right? So I mean, so what matters? I mean, we did an assessment. I think it's very interesting, considering what was the response to the AIDS epidemic and the TB epidemic. The TB epidemic has never gone away. I mean, this is there for centuries. So since mankind is known as one, and most recently COVID, and now monkeypox. I mean, we are in Brazil seeing many diseases coming back which were eradicated, and we are going to see this happening all over the world because of these stupid campaigns and this disaccreditation of the power of vaccines. So it's a level of stupidity that is hard to understand how people can adhere to those ideas. But unfortunately, we are living that. We are living sometimes some discredit to research, when and we are going sometimes to the dark ages, when people are going to pray instead of fighting for access to drugs. We would like to hear more of the audience here.
Thanks so much
Fellow
for
Brazilian.
thanks so much for being here. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. On Article 25, it says that healthcare is a human right. So that inspires several countries, including Brazil, to have universal healthcare. This was like championed by Eleanor Roosevelt, who became the first secretary of the Human Rights Commission. But here in this country, it is such a pressure to avoid that at all costs that it divides us in these little fights: HIV, TB, COVID, and now groups divided by diseases, basically. And the main fight, which should be the universal healthcare access, is not fought. And then you have states, municipalities, and individuals having to pay a huge price for medication. Because one of the things that to pass Obamacare was not being able to negotiate price of medication with pharmaceutical industries. The government cannot negotiate the price. That's absurd that the biggest buyer cannot negotiate the price of medication. But this is like just accepted here. I don't understand it. I think that maybe we are so divided in those little individual fights that we forget the main picture, that the main issue that affects everybody. And that would be it. I don't know if you can talk about it.
I think this is what we are lacking more and more is solidarity. I mean, what built the social movements was exactly the idea of urgency. It's funny because everybody who talks to us, to Mark, myself, or the old guys, on HIV and AIDS, they say like, you are always angry and you are always in a rush, etc. Because we have been always fighting for life. I mean, trying to rush against time because we were declared a dead man walking, so to say. So we have had this sense of urgency. When we look at tuberculosis, which kills 1,600,000 people a year exclusively, there is no urgency. People don't care. Why they don't care? Because it's poor people dying. That's the fact. What brought this incredible response for HIV and AIDS in the 80s was because white, gay men, middle class, educated people had AIDS, and the people who were publicly known. While the pandemic was all over the place, but this group provided the response because it was capable to do so. So we had to start social mobilization, Mark, myself, and so in 2002. I mean, there has never been a way. I mean, there are organizations which are over 100 years old, but people don't have urgency. I mean, when we talk about adoption of TB drugs, it takes 3-4 times more than AIDS drugs. And why it is happening? In my country, is under the same department. The National AIDS Program and TB Program are under the same roof, same rooms. And why for some drugs, I mean, you have accelerated process, and in tuberculosis is so slow because it's who is dying. So we have to have a stronger participation of people, have women leading. We have to have the voice of women and expressing and leading this planet. We need women on power, and we think that only with another eye, if we see the other as somebody with the same rights as you, this can change. Yeah, that's the drama of my country. I mean, where so inequity is so big, and people look at other. If somebody would have less rights, that's the same story. So thank you. Yeah, please.
Okay. I think my question is more for Ezio and Kenley. When you had successes, I guess, in fighting patents or breaking patents, were there conditions that you noticed, or what was the tipping point where you knew that you were going to successfully challenge a patent? And then is there anything there that can be replicated, I guess, here in the US or across the country? It could either be, I think, conditions locally, because I think here we thought, healthcare activists thought COVID might be the condition that, creates potential change, right? Or some challenges against patents or IP. It hasn't happened yet. But are there things like locally, conditions locally, or that you created as activists or advocates that allowed for those to happen, those successful challenges to happen?
Yes.
I like the colors.
Okay, oh wait, I'm not supposed to touch it. Wow, this is a real pivot though, but let me put it out there. I so appreciated this whole panel. Thank you for your brilliant work forever. And right now what's rising is, Mark, I really share your rage at the failure of the US government to set actual conditions to demand that their investment be returned appropriately, and instead to treat it like, everything from there on is a favor, that the pharmaceutical companies maybe should do this nice thing after they invested our money. And I'm thinking a lot, as I often do, about this mystical conflation of capitalism and nationalism, and the way in which capitalists actually really benefit a lot from a nationalist framing of these health emergencies. And in particular in the US, the pharmaceutical companies have benefited from framing the vaccine response as something that's being done for the American people. And this idea, that like the US boasting that we have the most of this thing or that thing, and completely negating the dynamics of actual pandemics, for one thing, but also the fact that most people in the US are not benefiting from that massive investment that was made with our money anyway. So I'm wondering what ideas you might have percolating about how do we break this mystical connection, this idea that US companies, for example, which they're not, it's this idea, this national wonderful sort of halo for especially in this particular moment where nationalism and white supremacy in the US is so ascendant. How do we challenge that and make people realize that these are not the same system?
Yeah,
A lot of notes from Kenley over there.
those are tough questions. But very important discussions. I think one of the things that you've succeeded in doing in the West is, I totally agree, elevating certain people or certain groups of people, especially if they have money, and use that money to literally enslave the minds of others, whether they're pharmaceutical or celebrities or whatever you call them. And so it becomes an easy for me as an outsider watching what goes on in countries like the US, that it's almost so easy that if I want to control certain minds, all I have to do is go on the internet, become a social influencer, and I can literally control a couple of thousand, millions of people. It is actually insane. And so I don't know whether they're sociologists and anthropologists and others who are beginning to try and understand that dynamic. But it's so unique to to maybe much more in the US and certainly in the North, that it confuses many responses and potential responses. I think one of the things that we've learned, for instance, in our world is you have to take things back to the community, make systems community-centered rather than centralized in the power and the hands of a few. I'll give you a very good example. When we were starting the AIDS response, the AIDS response was picking up, the delivery mechanisms were beginning to fail, even though there were drugs. People were still getting AIDS, in terms of AIDS-defining illnesses, TB, cryptococcal meningitis, and so on, which we are still getting them and they're still high. But one of the things that was happening is that the treatments, most of these people were actually in treatment and were failing. And so what we kept on saying way back in 2008, 2009, listen, you have got to center healthcare on community-based approaches. Nobody believed us. And so they carried on and this trend continued, treatment failure continued. And then suddenly someone came up with what we'd been saying, but gave it a nice little name called community-led delivery mechanisms. I forget the name, and wrote a paper about it from a university research. Suddenly everybody thought, well, maybe this makes sense because now it has come from a university, rather than believing that this is exactly what we were telling you. We didn't need to write a thesis to know this works. But what I'm trying to say is, in the end, we have now literally changed a focus of delivering medicine in the clinic to communities. And our viral load rates, which indicate how much virus people have in their body, which means they're either healthy or unhealthy, at risk of disease or not, are shooting up. Literally every country is over 90%, much better than any country, especially much higher than in the US. Because we centered care and delivered and moved care and focused discussions about care and healthcare in the community. Now here it's different. Everything is centralized and has to depend on power. And I think the biggest challenge and your very first step is, how do we get this back to the community? How do we mobilize, as we did? I mean, social mobilization hasn't changed. The principle is the same. It's probably how you do it. And I don't know whether you're going to know, I don't have the answer, whether you're going to need to use social media again, the very thing that captivated and has held you captive, whether you may need to come up with new models. And I really don't know what you may have to do. But the people have to own responses, and the people have to own things. I mean, that's what your favorite beast does, and is doing well. Donald Trump. He knows how to mobilize people, and he doesn't do it. He just makes one statement. The rest he leaves to his followers to do for him. So it is happening, and we know it happens, and we know it works. So how do we use it for good? How do we use it for public health? How do we use those models to improve health outcomes? I think I'll leave it there. I think I'll leave the second point to SU.
Thank you, Kelly. I think responding to your question, I think it all depends on the conditions that you create on the ground. I mean, if you don't have the conditions to compete or to challenge, it's very difficult. I mean, it's you have to aggregate people from different countries to make a global movement in order to reduce prices, etc. But effectively, a country or a region can only do that if it has the technical conditions to do so. I mean, Brazilian actually only broke patents once. The other things were threatening, like if you don't reduce the prices, I mean, we can break your patent. But Brazil just did that once. What has happening in the last over 20 years, and unfortunately, there was a huge disinvestment since the early 2000s, especially in the government of Lula. There was a big disinvestment in the national production, because the idea was that we could make more, spare money instead of producing, negotiating better with the pharmaceutical companies. But then there was a disinvestment in what the country has been doing 10 or more years before. And then the price is very high, because then when we come to COVID times, what we saw, the horror show that we saw in our both countries were particularly monstrous. I mean, when we saw the capacities down on the ground, I mean, seeing the United States not having enough masks, I mean, it was like shocking for us as well. I mean, basic things. I mean, and how the countries dealt with the pandemic and the inequality. From the civil society, we produced an assessment that shown how COVID has. We just watched it to the people in treatment for TB and HIV. This was a community-led assessment that shown in the middle of we did that pro bono in the beginning, then WHO came and supported the rest of the assessment that we did. We assessed like 500 people on treatment for HIV and AIDS in various regions of the country, and showed how the COVID pandemic was hitting the poor far stronger than any other group. So those disprivileged continue to be more disprivileged. Like the treatments are discontinued, tests are not provided, etc., etc., etc. So that's why I said earlier that we need a female approach to policies and to see things with another eye. I think the business the way of leading this planet has been proven not very effective. I mean, I think we need a change.
Because we're running out of time, and a lot of this seed of the work is what I feel like the disengagement of how things were documented, and where women were or the minority have not been properly documented. So a quick story that addresses maybe 3 of the questions that came up is actually working with experience on the ground, which they're both have said, bring it to the ground. In this moment that we're fighting abortion rights, is you have to, part of the activism is stamina. Like Mark and I have been doing this 30 years. It's extremely hard when it becomes communal betrayal or you're told no many times, and maybe because you got it wrong too. We've gotten it wrong many times. We've asked for AZT and this dosage, and that backfire, and the fallout of that, and to live through that is really, really hard. A story that I want to like take this space to do is, where did Beck go? Well, you don't say it's your wife or your lover. Let's so Sally Cooper, for example, by doing it, you know, she was a director of the Buyers Club, the PW Health Group. But one project that I was like, when you keep on doing this and you're using expertise as we grow, because you never know, like if you're doing a health fair, you don't know where, for example, Jason that helped me put it together, where he's going to be next year with that particular experience. So as a health group, I remember at Rikers, women have the right to get treatment in general for medicine. And during that AIDS crisis, nobody touched that. So they were dying consistently. So the health group, what Sally did, this problem came up that nobody has done it. So what she went in and said, look, we will take the budget of what it takes to bring medication and treatment that's allocated for women, specifically with HIV, and at that point they didn't know what it was, but they gave that formulation. It is this. And we want that contract. And we don't want even the contract money-wise. We know the cost. We just want access. We will pay it with our own, with the business that they did with bringing the Buyers Club. So they self-financed it, and they leveraged that they had the money to go in and properly do what the government would never do. So it's bypassing and waiting for who will tell us and budget for us. At times, being on the ground that long, we know what that number is and what the approach is. And so that's an example that is a story that continuously gets erased, but we've done that. And we should continue to pick those stories and continue to take it to today. What does it look like to send abortion pills across the country? Who's going to do that? Which are the states that are safe to do that? And you keep on practicing because you will find pockets of needs that need to be made. And you're creating a chain of people that will take leadership places and will take it to the next step, whether down the line we will ever achieve some kind of equality in healthcare by doing this work so that we can go to the polls and change that. But we need people to run those visions and those practices. So for me, it's a stamina and to try it until you find the solution so that you can tell government and the discussion is like, when we are, as taxpayers, pay for the research, how do we keep on saying that story and get that investment played out the way we want it? Because most Americans don't know that we actually, whatever the percentage, it doesn't matter if it's like 20% or 5% or 1%, we are still owners and partner in that research, and we still need to mobilize that message so that one day we are able to be in that table to negotiate that payback.
I want to give Ivy the last word. So I think
I love you for
that is the perfect.
I love you for making this happen.
I love you for making
2018,
this happen.
for making me meet Julie and making this whole thing happen and daring to, in a pandemic, do this project. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to just take the liberty of just reading one question we got online, which I think you just started to answer, Ivy, and we could be here all day with the answer, but I thought it was maybe something for us all to think about. If it's okay, if you'll grant me that. It's a question from Jason online, and thank you to everyone online who joined us, and also for those of you who are still with us here in the room. We're so grateful. So Jason wrote, it was so good hearing Yuseka Jubla's powerful voice at the AIDS meeting and now in this talk. A question for Ivy: who are other, both fallen and living women, long-term survivors you would like to tip your hat to and who should have more recognition in the movement? And I think something for us all to think about, like who are, because I think this is the question of the project that's upstairs, and please go see the biennial and go up to the 6th floor. You know, who are we not hearing from today? We've heard some really powerful voices, but I think that's a question you've made me think about a lot, Ivy, so thank you. And if you want to say anything, you get the last word.
Well, I think the work of Sally Cooper was really important, and you know, we did drop different places for that history. I think overseas, the women have a lot more clout, even from 40 years ago. I mean, the visual aids, unfortunately, Esther just walked out, recently did a presentation about women that are living with HIV, but there was a writer that in a popular newspaper had a column of HIV positive women and their stories, and we didn't have that in this country. So tapping into those stories and continues to see how they were able to organize and keep those stories are really the answer. And obviously Vuseca is like, you know, need to follow her all along, because knocking out this week was a big week for us. Thank you.